In this lesson we'll continue verifying identities, and we didn't do very much factoring in the previous lesson, so this is going to have more factoring. And we just want to make the left side of the identity look like the right side. Or left side of the equation look like the right side. So start with the larger expression, and you can make that smaller. Before we get started, let's make a short list of identities that we might use. So if we see cotangent, we might want to use that. And we have secant. So we might want to use that. Cosecant squared. We have cotangent cubed and secant. Looks like these might be the ones that we need, and we're going to, before we begin substituting, look for a common factor. This has cotangent, it has a secant, and another secant. So why don't we factor out a cotangent, and a secant. So if I take out a cotangent and a secant, we'll just have cosecant squared left. Here we're going to take out a cotangent and a secant, we'll have cotangent squared left. And now we see cosecant squared, cotangent squared. Well, those are appearing here. If we can make this appear here, then we can substitute. So I'm going to subtract and now everywhere that we see this, we can replace it with a 1. So this is going to be 1. Now let's look at cotangent and secant. Cotangent we could replace with cosine over sine. Secant is 1 over cosine. And 1 over sine, we didn't write that down, but that equals cosecant. And try this one on your own. Make a list of possible identities to use and then try them. If you get stuck, then just start over. So if you see sine squared, so we might need that. Tan squared, cosecant squared, tan cosine, and we have all the other ones. And then in addition to these, maybe we're going to need and remember that cosecant is 1 over sine. So there might be some more that we need, but we'll start with these. And let's look for a common factor. Tan squared and cosecant squared. Tan squared and cosecant squared. So if we take this out of here, we're left with sine squared. And if we take tan squared, cosecant squared out, we'll be left with cosine squared. Sine squared plus cosine squared is 1, so that's going to be 1. And we have tan squared, cosecant squared. Let's change them into sines and cosines. So tan is sine over cosine. So this is going to be sine squared over cosine squared. Cosecant is 1 over sine, so this will be 1 over sine squared. One over cosine squared. And when we verify identities, sometimes there's shorter ways to do it than others, and maybe you find a way that is shorter than how I do it, and that's still correct, or it's even better. So let's look at this, and I'm going to work on the left side to make it look like the right side. So pause the video and try to make the left side look like the right side. So if we are working on this side and we have tan squared, let's make sure we consider using this. And we have secant, well there's a secant there, and I think those are going to work together. Be aware that you have this. We know we want to switch into cosines, and so if we have a secant left over, we'll want to change that, and then tangent might help us with this. This might help us with the tangent. Now if we have two terms in the denominator, and now we have one term, we could create a Pythagorean identity here, which would then turn into, this will turn into a tan squared. And remember, when we verify identities, we can't multiply both sides by something. We have to just multiply this by 1, and that 1 is going to be 1 minus secant. And let's not distribute this yet. When we distribute this, we're going to go 1 times 1, negative secant, positive secant, and minus secant squared. These cancel, and we'll have 1 minus secant squared. And 1 minus secant squared. Let's look back up here. And here we can make this turn into, or we could just move the secant over there. 1 minus secant squared is negative tangent squared. So if I subtract secant squared, subtract tangent squared, we'll end up with this. And now we see this in our current equation, and we can replace it with that. So this becomes negative tangent squared. We have 1 minus secant. It'll be distribute the negative. It'll be a negative 1 plus secant so we had a negative here. It'll make that negative and then make that positive. Now we need to go to cosine, so we'll have this is going to be 1 over cosine, and this is going to be cosine over cosine. That equals 1. So we have 1 minus cosine. So here we can work on either side to make it look like the other side. Let's work on the left side. So pause the video and try that. So let's make sure we consider 1 plus tan squared is secant squared. And it looks like that's the only one we're going to need. Let's see what happens. We have a common factor, secant squared. Secant squared minus 1, we see that up here, secant squared minus 1 equals tan squared, so this is tangent squared. And then we can replace secant squared with 1 plus tangent squared because we don't want secant. We see that everything's a tangent, so let's replace secant with 1 plus tangent squared. and we'll distribute and we'll end up with that. And we just switch the order there, and it'll be the same. So let's work on the right side. Since it's larger, we can make it smaller to look like the left side. And pause the video, try that one. So again, we're looking at tangent and secant, so let's consider 1 plus tan squared equals secant squared. And that's probably the only one we're going to need. Here we have, we haven't seen this type of factoring yet. With trigonometry, we've done this with exponentials. And all we're going to do is see that it is, we can make it look like a quadratic. And if we do that, and that, so we can see that this is something squared, and that's that same thing that it is squared over here. If you aren't able to factor like this, you can just write it with a u, and we'll say that u is tangent squared. Then we can factor like this. So 1 times 1 is 1. U plus u is 2u, and u times u is u squared. Now we can substitute back in. U is tangent squared. And 1 plus tangent squared is secant squared. Don't need that. And then we'll get secant to the 4th is secant to the 4th. And I'll stop there for today.